Hey, this is Patrick, and today I'm making a basic runway in YSF. Alright, the first thing that I do when I make a runway is I use a reference map. I generally try to take a picture of or a screenshot of an aerial view and lay it out so that I try to get the image to be a representation of a 2,000 by 2,000 meters square. The reason is it's easy to scale. If it's a big airport, I might have to go to either 4,000 meter or even 8,000 meter and then scale the image up in the reference map moving tool. But that makes it a little bit easier to size the reference map in the editor. You'll still have to move it around a little bit. I got really close on this one, but I still had to rotate and move it just a little bit to get it into place. But the reason for the reference map, especially on the runway, is that every airport is a little bit different on the way the lines are laid out. So there are some pretty much standardized runway lines, but I haven't figured out exactly what that standard is. So I generally customize my lines according to the airport layout of the airport I'm making at the time, and reference maps make that really easy. Okay, so to make the lines, I use the center line tool. And you can see here that all I'm doing is making the center line that normally would go down the center of the runway, but instead I'm using it in this way, so it makes a series of lines to represent those lines at the end of the runway. You can also use the thick, actually this line was the runway edge line that I used a thick line to make. And here's what I'm talking about with the center line. The center line tool is really convenient for making this kind of runway line. The markings that are on the runway, touchdown markings and things like that. And what I do is, instead of kind of as a way to save time, instead of doing both sides of the runway, you can see that I've laid out the runway so that it is centered right on the 0, 0, 0 point, the coordinate on the map. So I'm only doing the markings on the left side of the runway coming in from the left. And you'll see in a few minutes that it's easy, once you have the markings made, to copy and paste them and then move them to the opposite side. Okay, and you'll also notice that I'm changing the number for each marking, because the way the markings work, or the way the center line works, is that you have the white dash, then you have a blank spot, then you have a white dash, a blank spot, and on and on. And that number represents both the number of dashes and the number of blank spots. So if you have a single white dash, all you need is the number 1, or even the number 0 would work. If you have two lines like there, you'll need you have the white line, you have a blank spot, then a white line, so that would be 3. 2 white lines and a blank spot. Now, this is what I'm talking about: copy and paste, and then move it. Okay, and you can either copy and paste, or you can copy move the one you just copied and then paste, and the one you paste is going to be exactly where the one you copied was. Okay, so the element that you copy, when you paste it, will paste over the original element. Okay, so once you have all the runway markings at one end of the runway finished, all you have to do is copy them, paste them, rotate them, and then move them to the opposite end. So basically, if you're on a negative end, you just take off the negative to make it positive, and there you go. Runway markings are in place on both ends now. While we're here, we might as well make the runway end lights. Now, in real life, they would be red from one side and blue from the other, but we can't really do that in YSF, so we'll just make them blue to indicate the ends of the runways. And using the Runway Light tool makes it easier. And again, because the runway is symmetrical because of the way we laid it out, and most airport runways are symmetrical, this is not that difficult. You just tell it how many lights you want to cross there. In this case, I did 10. And you make your 3 points. And there you go. We can also go ahead and do our runway edge lights. Some runways do have center lights, some don't. Some have all kinds of lighting that you can do. And there you go. I'll even show you the night view here in a second when I get this finished. Well, you can see the actual lights. Okay, so there it is. So now we're going to insert the center line on the runway. And this is where the center line tool is actually used in the way it was created, to make the center line. They can be a little tricky to space sometimes. What I do is I'll start the first point on one end. Then when I get ready to work on the other end, I'll go to that end, because the end with the 2 final points, which is the opposite end of the first point, is where it gets tricky on the runway line spacing. As you can see there, there's a blank space. Now I told you that that number represents the number of dashes and blank spaces. So you have to make sure that the last dash is at the very end of the line, and there's not a blank space there, because then it's not symmetrical. So you have to be careful of that. If I don't know how many lines there are on the runway, I usually go with the second option in the runway line box there and set it for 30 meters between them. But in this case, I knew how many. Adding the runway numbers, pretty easy. You just add text. The only problem is the font used for the text in YSF's scenery editor isn't very realistic, but it's easier than making the numbers by hand. You'll have to adjust the angle of the number to match the angle of the runway, and that's pretty much it. All you have to do there is rotate the runway to whatever angle it needs to be in.